Good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today. We've got a fantastic and very informative session for you. I'm Varun Sriram with Generation UCAN, and absolutely thrilled to be joined by Cliff Scherb and Dr. Cathy Yeckel. For those of you guys that are gearing up for the presidential debate tonight, this is your pregame show, and I promise there's going to be a lot less mudslinging between these two. Cliff and Cathy, thank you guys so much. Really appreciate you being on here with us today.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thank you.
Little bit of background on both of you. I'd love to have you guys introduce yourself to the audience before we really get rolling. And after you do that, I'll sort of lay out our agenda for today. But Cliff, let's start with you. So for everyone that's tuned in, we're really lucky to have Cliff here with us. Cliff is a record-setting Type 1 diabetic Ironman triathlete. He boasts the second fastest Ironman time by a Type 1 athlete. And I believe the fastest time at the 70.3 World Championships. Additionally, Cliff's also a coach, works with a bunch of diabetic athletes, non-diabetic athletes as well, and he's also an entrepreneur. Just recently released a very fascinating app called Engine 1 for blood sugar management. Cliff, a lot of accolades, a lot of titles. What else can you tell folks about your experience in this space and in this topic area today on blood sugar management?
Sure, thanks, Vern. I'm excited to be here and share the mic here with Cathy as well. Yeah, so my background, I eat, sleep, and breathe triathlon, swimming, biking, running. I have done so my whole life. I have a real hard time sitting still, and I like being on the front lines of working with athletes and non-athletes and helping them, aspire to be their best. And so, this is one of my favorite topics, is how to keep people, out on the road, happy, with stable blood sugar, so that they're able to have the energy they need and be their best. So yeah, I've worked with lots of different athletes, from beginner to professional, and one of the most confusing areas, I think, is certainly blood sugar management, fueling in general. And so this is a great topic. It goes hand in hand with UCAN, and I'm really honored to be here and hopefully give you guys a few pearls to take home and practice out there.
Well, that's great, Cliff, and we're really excited to hear not only about your own personal experience, in terms of managing your blood sugar for exercise, but also the feedback, as you stated, you've worked with a wide range of athletes. So excited to get all that perspective from you, and absolutely thrilled to be joined as well by Dr. Cathy Yeckel, who has joined us on a few of these different sessions to lend her expertise. Dr. Yeckel, Cathy, she's a assistant clinical professor at the Yale School of Public Health, and she's been involved with a significant amount of research on human metabolism and exercise. So, Cathy, really excited to have your expertise in this topic area. This particular topic on blood sugar management and blood sugar management for diabetic athletes, why is this so near and dear to your heart?
Like Cliff, for one, thanks for having me, and it's wonderful to be here with Cliff, and I'm really excited to learn from him, actually. But as he lives, sleeps, breathes the whole 9 yards in terms of type 1 diabetes and sport, and particularly endurance sports, right? Swim, bike, and run. I've been a runner pretty much all my life, and so I love all the puzzles that come with metabolism. So for me, it's the challenge of figuring out how do you put the glucose metabolism together with the fat metabolism, and what are the challenges with diabetes, not only type 1 diabetes, but type 2, with prediabetes, with obesity, because we all, and even normal metabolism, we all share lots of challenges, but we can learn a lot from each of these kinds of conditions. So hopefully everyone will learn a little bit tonight.
Well, that's great perspective, Cathy. And before we really get started and dive into the meat of our discussion, just to set the agenda for folks that are on here live with us today, we'll be going here for about the next hour. And initially, we are going to start off by diving a little bit more specifically into those challenges that Cathy was just speaking to, and get some perspective from Cliff as a type 1 diabetic athlete. Some of the challenges that Cliff has faced that really can be extrapolated to all of us who are exercising, like Cathy stated. From there, we want to give you guys a quick summary about the Engine 1 app and UCAN from a nutrition standpoint, and how it can provide a solution to some of those challenges. And then we really want to dive into the specific times where athletes, whether they're diabetic or not, need to focus on managing their blood sugar. And we'll separate that into pre, during, and post-exercise and give you a lot of specific situations and recommendations for all those settings. So really excited to dive in there. Cliff, let's start really by talking about the challenges in terms of glucose management, blood sugar management. What are some of the biggest challenges you as a type 1 diabetic athlete face, and what are sort of the challenges you've seen across the board for the wide range of athletes you work with?
Sure. So for type 1 diabetes, you are basically insulin dependent, and you are taking insulin supplementation because your body's not making it. So that hormone, as you take it into your body, is really dictating all of the glucose management, the fat metabolism, as Cathy was mentioning, and basically you are more or less driving your car. It is not an automatic, it is a standard, and it requires quite a bit of manipulation to get it right. And then to throw into the mix activity, it really gets a little bit tricky. More specifically, the more intensive the activity, the more you're going to find that blood sugar tends to crash. And so essentially, getting that mix of insulin and carbohydrate right is really what took me many, many years of crashing and burning in training to more or less test it on myself to figure out, hey, how does this actually work? What is the optimal amount of insulin? How do I prevent lows? How do I prevent high blood sugars? And for a non-diabetic, these are things that don't really apply to them as much. However, everything we're going to talk about tonight really does apply immediately and can directly impact somebody's performance in that way. So it's kind of like the lessons you learn from the type 1s actually are like the gems really that can help you with your own training. So I would say it was really, really tough early on to figure out that the most minimal amount of insulin you can have before an activity is the right amount. And that's not very easy if you're type 1 because the insulin that you're taking has a duration of action that's up to 4.5 or more hours. So if you take an insulin injection and you're about to eat some carbohydrate, that insulin injection will last with you if you're type 1 for 4.5 hours. So somebody who's a non-diabetic, if they decide to go and be active, they still will have a relatively high amount of insulin on board if they consume carbohydrates prior to activity. However, their body's going to turn it off really quick, and that insulin levels are going to drop very rapidly. And so the supplementation that has to keep ongoing with a type 1 is really where the trickiness happens, right? How much to take in, when, and how much can you actually even absorb. So those are some of the challenges that you face as a type 1, a very active type 1, even just going for a walk.
And Cliff, I think you sort of just did this here at the latter part of what you were talking about, but just up front so people can be clear, what is type 1 diabetes? What are the challenges? I mean, you've spoken about the challenges, but what is type 1 diabetes?
Sure, it's an autoimmune disorder, right, that your body basically is not producing insulin, the hormone insulin. And that's what helps absorb metabolism, fat, proteins, and carbs, basically. And you can be diagnosed at a young age, but even up to the ages of 30 and 40 we're seeing nowadays. And type 1 represents about 10% of the population, and the bulk of everybody else is type 2 at the greater rate.
And for you personally, when did you find out you had type 1? How long have you been dealing with this in your own life?
Yeah, I was diagnosed at the age of 9, and I found that activity was something that was so important because it helped me balance blood sugar as well. So insulin worked better, my glucose control was better. I won't say that doing long course triathlons was always easy until I figured it out. That took a long time of figuring it out, but then nowadays that's kind of the advice that I dispense to a lot of folks who want to try and do what I've done too.
Cathy, in the context of challenges, we heard Cliff bring up this hormone insulin a multitude of times, and he did speak a little bit about the role of insulin. What else can you add in terms of the role of insulin in the body?
Okay, so the role of insulin in the body is it's the main, what's called the hormone. So it's that messenger that's telling tissues to take up blood sugar. So you're taking up your glucose, and there are tissues that need it to respond. So under resting conditions, your muscle is one of those tissues that has to see insulin to take up the sugar in the blood. And there are special receptors that do that. Fat is another tissue that has to, under normal conditions, has to see the hormone insulin and respond to it to be able to take up the blood sugar. So the cool thing about exercise is exercise becomes insulin independent. So you don't need insulin to take it up. But what happens is that means if you have insulin on board, as Cliff was saying, it's a double whammy. So you're not only pulling it up independent in terms of the muscle, but you also have insulin that's pulling in glucose as well. So it can be real problematic for somebody with type 1 to be able to, or anyone actually. So if anyone eats too soon to when they exercise, their blood sugar can go down because their insulins are high. If they've had carbohydrate before they've, within, say, and it's particularly that sort of, there's a zone of sort of an hour to 2 hours, it's kind of scary for people because that's when insulin's high, glucose is high, and you're going to have this double effect on the muscle. The muscle can pull it in by itself, but it also is going to respond to the insulin itself.
And, I think you guys both touched on this, but things like blood sugar and insulin, I mean, perhaps in the past, or I'm sure there's still some of this today where people look at these as things that only people with diabetes have to worry about. But Cliff, I think you might have said it off the top, or Cathy, there are lessons we can learn because we really all want to manage our blood sugar levels. And so when you talk about sort of the blood sugar dropping prior to exercise, I mean, for the average person, they can think of low blood sugar simply as being low energy, right? Or the endurance athlete might articulate it as, oh, I bonked, and that's really oftentimes low blood sugar.
Exactly. The same symptomatically, sweating, dizziness, confusion, same thing. And the leverage effect of insulin, prior to an activity, let's say you take 1 unit of insulin and it's for an apple. You may then take that same amount of insulin during activity. That 1 unit is going to cover about 10 or even 15 apples. So it's the leverage effect of activity Cathy was talking about is dramatic, and it's something that's so hard to even measure for us as type 1s. Like the numbers and the math starts to get really complicated, and that's why I invented Engine 1. But it's incredibly difficult. But reducing that insulin prior to an activity or even during is something that I try to do for myself personally, so that I have that peace of mind that I'm not going to crash or bonk. Because anybody who's ever experienced that, whether you're type 1 or not, it is just no fun.
Cliff, you've told us about some of the challenges.
It might be worth...
Go ahead, Cathy.
I was just going to say it might be worth pointing out that people that have been told they're insulin resistant, so maybe they're overweight, have type 2 diabetes, oftentimes they eat and 3 hours later their insulins are still very high. And that's the same problem that Cliff or people with type 1 are going to run into right before exercise. So say somebody with type 2 or somebody that has prediabetes or is obese, even if they've eaten 3 hours before and their insulins are still high because their tissues just can't respond very well, the minute they go to exercise, they have the exact same problem. The insulins are going to be too high to start the exercise. And all of a sudden, you're going to, the glucoses will drop.
So that's a great perspective. Now, Cliff has told us about some of the challenges, kind of the practical challenges in exercising and situations he deals with. From a research perspective, Cathy, what are the challenges there? I mean, what do we and what don't we know based on lab studies?
I think, there's such elegant work that's been done with type 1, but type 1 is really hard to study. And as Cliff has been pointing out, it's taken him a long time, and that's just for one person. And you can just imagine if you're trying to bring people in to study something very specifically and control for all the other factors, it's really hard. I mean, there was a study that was done not that long ago, and every single person that they brought in, they even just did it in the real world context. They all managed it differently. So they did the same race, but they all did it. They all they all adjusted their insulins differently, and they took into carbohydrate differently. So I mean, I think it just points to the fact that research is terrific, and it can get us some patterns and can help us start to develop some guidelines. but there's so much individual variability, and there's so many variations. I mean, say you want to go play soccer versus wanting to go do a triathlon. I mean, they're not necessarily even comparable. It's like apples and oranges when it comes to what the metabolism is doing. So how do you do guidelines for all the different kinds of sports? So I think there are real challenges. I think there's been lots that's been very elegant. There's a lot that's been going on right now with can we try to have people do small amounts of sprints on top of, like, say, running, and have it be so that they can control their blood sugar better. So there are little steps forward, but in general, we're a long way away research-wise to having a really good picture. And that's why things like Engine 1, if we can start to have apps that people can use and that are user-friendly and that can help people, all of a sudden you take a lot of the guesswork out of each person's livelihood and their ability to exercise.
And taking the guesswork, Cliff, out of things, that's pretty much precisely why you were involved with the creation of Engine 1. So I want to turn the screen over to you just for a couple minutes here before we get specifically into the pre, during, and post period. It would be great, because this is such a valuable tool, and you come to it with a great database of real-world experience. Would love to have you just briefly tell us what Engine 1 is and show us a little bit of the app. So anybody who's following along on the screen, you should now be able to see the app in front of you. Cliff, tell us what Engine 1's all about.
Yeah, great. So Engine 1 really was created for selfish reasons for myself, because I just frankly was low and frustrated with going low all the time, and there were a lot of complex factors that were going into it, including nutrition, blood sugar, insulin, and timing of all these things. So it's like a Swiss Army knife underneath the app here that's kind of like doing things in the background. So Engine 1, this is your landing screen, and what it allows you to do is update your blood sugar, your insulin, and your food. So you can use a barcode scanner, and you can have your dinner, have your tabbouleh, a half cup. You can confirm the intake, and then it's processing all that information, and then you can also select what time that happened. Let's say we're going to update our blood sugar as well, and so let's say our blood sugar is 115, and we'll save that. And then lastly, we'll update our insulin and say that we took only a little bit of insulin because we thought we were going to be active. We really didn't want to take too much because we were afraid we were going to go low. So that's 0.41 units of insulin. So we go back to the landing screen, and now we've got this dashboard that's telling us how much insulin is actually in the body. So there's 0.41 units on board. Then it's telling us how much food needs to be eaten prior to activity so that you don't go low. And then it actually tells you how much to take with you into that activity so you don't go low. You can even set reminders for all these things. But I think one of the neat parts about pre-activity phase of this is you can look into the future and say, hey, I don't want to start now, but I want to start in the future. And what you can notice is the carb demand keeps going down. That's because the insulin is timing out of the system. So this concept that we've been talking about where, the more insulin that's on board to start an activity is going to basically mean more carbohydrate consumption. So that, the goal really, if you're trying to maintain a lean body metabolism and teach the body to burn fat as a source of fuel, should be to try to have a minimum amount of insulin on board. And this is the way it's accomplished. What's really interesting about insulin is the more insulin you have in your system, the more it's going to tell your body to store fat and to basically burn glycogen as an energy source. And so it's very hard to lean out the more insulin you have in your system. So the ideal kind of fat-burning type of workout, if your goal is to lean out, have a better body composition, stable blood sugar, those sorts of things, is to try not to eat sugary types of things or very high starchy things before an activity. It's not always that simple in the real world. Not everybody can just say, hey, I'm just going to not eat something for 2 hours prior to their activity. But I think, if you have some activities during the week where you can try it out, this is the benefit. And obviously where I had a great interest in UCAN for that reason, because it's so slow burning that the amount of insulin needed is minimal, like minimal, very minimal. So that's kind of the pre-activity phase, and maybe we can talk a little bit more about what we're doing during exercise and how the setup happens.
Absolutely. So we'll dive a little bit more into just pre-activity, your experience, Cliff, in fueling for pre-activity, what folks who want to manage their blood sugar should focus on pre-activity. But I want to just take 2 or 3 minutes to talk a little bit about something you just mentioned, which is UCAN. So, knowing that a lot of people here on the session may or may not be familiar with what UCAN is from a nutrition standpoint. Cliff, you alluded to it in the context of being able to stabilize your blood sugars, and UCAN from a carbohydrate standpoint is very unique in its ability to do that. So quick background, with UCAN, what's so unique about the product, and it comes in powder and bar form, is this carbohydrate that we use that we call super starch. So super starch is basically a slow releasing, low glycemic starch that keeps your blood sugar steady over an extended period of time. It's derived from a non-GMO cornstarch that goes through a very specific cooking process with heat and water that contributes to that slow and steady breakdown of the starch. So it's very different than your traditional sugar-based, high glycemic, fast-acting carb sources in terms of how it delivers energy. And really the uniqueness of the super starch comes from the origins. Cathy, can you just speak to the origins of what super starch was created for and what the original problem that it was addressing was?
Yeah, I mean, we've been talking about type 1 diabetes here, but even a more fundamental problem are the people that can't even produce their own blood sugar. So talk about going low, they don't they don't even make their own blood sugar. So glycogen storage disease, and here's Jonah here, and it was developed, I mean, super was pretty much developed so that people people that have glycogen storage disease, and they, this is an inborn error of metabolism, so people are born with it and they have it their whole life, can actually try to slowly regulate their sugars without having to take in lots and lots of extra carbohydrate and lots of extra calories, because it's sort of tuning it in, finding that sweet spot, as we're saying, and just as the same way as that Cliff wants to do before exercise and during and afterwards, it really was designed and developed for people that had to have this. Otherwise, and their parents would get up every couple hours to feed them because they weren't producing their own blood sugar. So it's super starch is really allowing a very, very slow time released glucose to hit the system.
And what you're talking about, Cathy, is really what we're seeing on the screen. So with the super starch, Cathy spoke about the origins, and then prior to launching into consumer nutrition and sports nutrition, we conducted a clinical trial wanting to test our super starch, this slower releasing starch, this low glycemic starch, against maltodextrin, which is typical higher glycemic carbohydrate that you find in many popular sports nutrition standpoints. And this sort of tells the story in terms of what super starch can offer for blood sugar management, instead of that traditional up and down sugar spike that requires frequent refeeding and frequent redosing. And Cliff will certainly identify the challenges that can present for somebody with type 1. The super starch is trickling much more slowly and steadily and providing that steady blood sugar and steady energy. But Cathy, another interesting thing, we've talked a little bit about insulin, is the role of this carbohydrate on insulin. Super starch doing in terms of the way it's impacting insulin that makes it so different than other types of carbohydrates?
Right. So as you can see in the graph, with the maltodextrin, you have to, there's a large amount of glucose that's hitting the system very, very quickly, and so insulin has to respond to be able to put it away, right? Or in the case of Cliff, he's going to have to give himself a large bolus of insulin to be able to take care of it. Whereas if you can have a starch like super starch that has this slowly digesting property, it can dribble on and it can almost come in under the radar and not be detected, so that the insulin requirement is really low. And so it can persist for very slowly for hours and hours, and yet it needs very little insulin to be able to operate.
Blanket. I call it the security blanket. As a type 1, you hate to go low, and it's so frustrating, and you're confused, but it's really nice once you have that bar. In my mind, I'm thinking for the next at least 2 hours, I'm pretty good.
So Cliff, let's specifically talk about that pre-workout period. I mean, what are some of the biggest, again, we start with the challenges, what are some of the biggest challenges that someone with type 1 might face in terms of fueling prior to activity or exercise?
Well, there's this this really trickiness to, am I going to go undergunned with how much insulin I'm going to take going into an activity, right? And then you run the risk of then your blood sugar going much higher because you're going to eat something. And the timing is just kind of off because let's say you're hungry an hour and a half to 2 hours prior to an activity, right? And then you're taking an insulin that's going to work for 4.5. So we already know you're in trouble because you're telling yourself you have to take less insulin prior to an activity that you know is going to drive you down. So you've got this kind of mental discount of how much insulin you're going to take, and before you know it, you don't know how much to take, how much to eat, and then if something, an activity starts 30 minutes sooner or later, those windows really matter. The duration of insulin action, there's a peak up to an hour, hour and a half after you consume carbs, that insulin's working, and we're talking about injectable insulin, not non-diabetics. And so that phase is critical to kind of get right. And I try to tell people it's kind of like separating braking and swerving if you were riding a bicycle. So when you go into turn, you don't want to be braking hard at the same time because you're going to crash. And the same is kind of true right before an activity. Really what you want to do timing-wise is have fats, good fats, and lean proteins to kind of satiate you. That's AKA kind of like UCAN in terms of its profile and how slow it's absorbed. So, and this, not everybody does this, but what I like to do and what I recommend to people that I work with is that if they're in that 90-minute or under window, that they consume either a very modest amount of carbohydrate or no carbohydrate, or they're going to go for something like a protein or a good fat, avocado or egg white, things like that. And those all still break down into glucose. Everything breaks down to the glucose. At the end of the day, it's all sugar, in my mind. It eventually hits the bloodstream and does something. So the question is how soon are you going to be absorbing it? How soon are you going to be needing it? And is that balance adequate?
And, Cathy, what's interesting is, so like Cliff was alluding to, ultimately everything is breaking down into glucose, which I'm sure could cause some confusion for people because simultaneously, while everything might be breaking down to glucose, it's really the rate at which it's delivered that's so critical, especially for somebody with diabetes, correct? So how do you sort of explain that into people's minds where they think if it's all breaking down to glucose, then it might all be the same, I could eat whatever I want, but in reality, that's not the case.
Yeah, well, let me address something first just so that we're all on the same page. When you take in a fat, it's not really breaking down into glucose. It's just actually making the tissues a little bit more insulin resistant. So it ends up having your blood sugar do something a little bit different and when you eat a protein, there are a lot of the amino acids that do become sugar. So not everything breaks down into sugar, but in terms of somebody who has type 1 and has to think about insulin, they do still have to think about what that fuel is and when they have, how to do their insulin budget, because each fuel can change the glucose profile in the blood specifically. Hopefully that makes sense. In terms of the actual carbohydrates, when we're talking about something like superstarch that's really, really slow, I mean, when they first developed it for the kids with glycogen storage disease, they wanted those kids to be able to last 9 hours with one dosing, right? So that the kids could sleep through the night. So whereas this formulation with superstarch we use for exercise and this kind of thing, as Cliff said, he's talking about, can we get something that's working 2 to 3 hours worth? And some of us don't have his metabolism, so it probably would work. For me, probably 3 or 4 hours, I'm good, right? But then there are things that, like, you drink a soda pop or a Coke, and that's hitting your system really hard, really fast. So that is like pure sugar right away. There's barely any delay. You're going to feel it, and that's important when somebody is hypoglycemic. But in general, it's not important for most people to take in these really rapid acting carbs. It's just adding lots of calories that you can't take back.
Cliff, for the athletes that you work with that do have diabetes, do you find that they're more likely to be sort of grabbing whatever's quick and convenient prior to a workout, and that impacts their blood sugars, or are they more likely, as you said, to simply not eat anything before a workout because they're not sure how it'll impact their blood sugars? Is there sort of one or the other people gravitate towards, or do you have people that fall in both buckets?
There's definitely people that fall into both buckets. There's some people who are over-prepared. There's some people who are completely under-prepared. I think probably the more recent, if you will, last 5 years, people that I work with, life is very busy, very hectic, and when you're reaching for something, it's always not necessarily the option that you're looking for. So, I try to educate people that I'm working with that they really want to be taking, different options with them, basically, when they're traveling or when they're going to, school if they're kids, or, but yeah, it's tricky. Some people over-prepare, under-prepare. It depends on what people are doing. Like my long course athletes for, ultra triathlon, they're pretty smart about this stuff. They've got like these big organized backpacks they're taking with them everywhere. They've got meals in there. And then there's, other folks who are a little more recreational where they don't really have to think about, well, am I going to drive the car from New York to Boston, or am I just driving it around town? And, that in terms of how much gas you're going to put in the tank is really an important decision to make. So it depends on how far you're going.
How much education do you find that you had to, both self-educate as well as educate for your athletes in terms of the difference in quality of carbohydrate, that education behind not all carbohydrates are going to impact your blood sugars the same, and not all types of carbohydrates will necessarily necessitate the same amount of insulin to be taken in?
Yeah, believe it or not, I think actually a lot of times the activity and the training and the advice that I'm able to dispense to people, they get it very quickly, and that advice works well. When it comes to the nutrition side of things, it's an uphill battle. It's very tricky to say, okay, I've got 4 options presented in front of me. What am I going to take? And I don't think everybody necessarily has the background for it. But it's one of those things where a conversation just helps start it off and gets people in the right direction. But I think it's a conversation I have with a lot of people.
Now, from a UCAN perspective, Cliff, I'm curious, how did UCAN come on your radar? And in that pre-workout period, how do you find yourself most commonly using it? And how, perhaps, is it different from what you were doing prior to UCAN existing? Or how are you kind of factoring in your insulin, the amount of insulin that you need to take relative to the amount of UCAN you take?
Yeah, it's a very interesting position, because UCAN can do so many different things. It fits in a place where other foods just don't. And what I mean by that is, so if I'm going to go and do some sort of extended activity, what I may do is just leave my basal rate on, have a bar, and go. And that's great because the basal rate, and basal rate is basically insulin that's dripped in the background. If you're a pumper, somebody who has an insulin pump, but it's a small amount of insulin that's kind of just cruising around the background. And UCAN kind of just matches it along the way. The other ways you can do it, you can bolus for it. If you're going to bolus for it, again, the timing is really very tricky because UCAN is so slow. It's just so slow, so metabolically great and sound for blood sugar that you would, for instance, if you were trying to treat a low blood sugar, you were in a bonked state, it'd be pretty tough. You'd be waiting a long time for UCAN to help out. That's not what it's all about. UCAN is the security blanket. It's not the rescue dose. So I look at it as kind of always like the starting point for an activity for me. And I always try to reduce the insulin load and burden before, but this is probably more technical for the type 1s out there, but when and how much you bolus becomes more of an engine 1 question, then I can give advice probably even on the cast here.
Cathy, just to kind of expand on what Cliff just said, what can we take away from what Cliff's talking about in terms of managing blood sugar from a type 1 diabetic standpoint, just for general population, whether or not they do have diabetes? Anything that we can learn from what Cliff said that we can all apply across the board, whether or not we have diabetes?
Well, I think one of the key messages is that we should really all be thinking about planning. Let's face it, we have a huge problem with overweight and obesity in general, And everyone usually can look at themselves and say, okay, I could use a little leaning down, right? And one of the things that is clear from some of the studies is if, say you were going to exercise at lunchtime, your breakfast then matters, because even 3 or 4 hours later, if you've had something that has that high glycemic index and has more of a rapid carbohydrate in it, you're going to burn less fat later on. And it's like, can be like double. And that's whether you're going to walk later, run later, so it seems to go across the board. And even at rest later, you're burning more fat if you've had something that is more like superstarch and more of a low glycemic index for breakfast. So I think one of the real important things to get out of tonight, I hope, is the idea that everyone should start to look at how they plan their day in terms of food. Because if you're trying to lean down, it starts to matter how much extra stuff you're just taking in just to take it in, and that it's actually hurting you in terms of fat burning because your insulins are too high. So for Cliff, he's having to take insulin at a certain time. So if he's using superstarch or taking a bar and doesn't have to, it can only have that basal running in the background, he's much more likely to be able to burn more fat than if he's having to do a big bolus of insulin, which is basically going to shut down fat oxidation, period. So but that's for everybody, that's true. It's just that we don't have to take it. That's just the way our body's going to respond. If we ingest a lot of high carbohydrate, we're going to have insulin come on. It has to be there, and then that's going to inhibit fat oxidation.
And, Cathy, with the point that you're speaking to, I mean, it's something we see so frequently when we're at different running expos, and, people are used to these traditional bagels, bananas, energy gels, different high glycemic carbs before exercise, and then they sort of express the struggle that they may have losing weight during running. I think the way you've explained it, it's kind of telling us that some of these faster acting carbohydrates in that period right before exercise are not optimal if we have a weight loss or a fat burning or fitness goal in mind.
Yeah. I think it's worth jumping just for a second towards the recovery process. I know we're kind of trying to hit them in order here, but my recommendation for a lot of folks is to time a lot of their carbohydrate immediately post-workout. Okay, you're talking 60 to 90 minutes, 2 hours after is your best shot, your best window where your body is just primed to be taking in glucose. And the really interesting part of being a type 1 and how this applies to everybody else is after an activity, the amount of insulin you need to replenish glycogen storage, much less. So prior to activity, right, you need a far greater amount to start making that glucose be motivated to be used. So at the end of the day, I have a total in my insulin pump, and I look at that number, and it's the over-under. And 30 units is kind of my sweet spot. If I'm above 30 units, I know it's like trying to put in, 22 gallons in a tank that only holds 20. I'm going to gain weight. I'm going to put fat, or I'm going to just, be larger. It's true. If I'm under by more than about 2 units for me, so if I'm at 28 units, I'm going to be kind of light. I may be a little bit bonky, and I may, be hungry going into bedtime. But that, sensitivity and keeping that number low, below 30 or like just slightly under, can be achieved much more easily when you eat carbs after your activity, you parse out the carbs during and before, and it's the same pattern that replicates over and over again. It doesn't matter if you're a world champion or you're just somebody who just wants to go for a walk down the street. Metabolism and physiology doesn't care who you are. It's just the same. So that's a great, thing that I would say to take home for people is, obviously Cathy's got it right, the beginning of activity is such an important setup, but certainly also the back end is pretty important too.
Cliff, on that point, and certainly this might vary day to day in terms of how much activity you're doing and the intensity of the exercise you've done that day, but do you have a general number in terms of grams of carbohydrate you try to consume in a given day, or is that going to be very dependent on what that day looks like for you?
Yeah, I think it's always dependent for me upon the day, and I like to have kind of a loose schedule when it comes to my training. I'm not preparing for anything specific at the moment. When I am preparing specifically, I do try to make sure that I am hitting a pretty good number, of quality fresh carbohydrate, and at those times that I'm describing. but it's such a sliding scale, and I think that's another tricky thing for athletes to get right, or even non-athletes, is just how much carbs am I eating per day. Everybody doesn't do well on a high-fat, high-carbohydrate diet. Okay, it's either one or the other. So if you're very active, right, you need a lot more carbs, the fat demand goes down. If you're not as active, the fat component comes up, but the protein component comes up dramatically. And so those relationships, the percentages, you know, if you're exercising for only 30 minutes a week versus, you know, 15, 20 hours a week, substantially different. So I guess to answer your question is, and the really interesting part is, insulin, the total, it's the same every day for me. So it doesn't matter if I eat a ton of carbs or no carbs, that total number is always the same. So when I look at and I investigate, and I've done this for so many individuals for Engine 1, they have these high variability with insulin. The more insulin, right, on a day that's a rest day, that says to me either they didn't eat enough the day before, or they really are just, again, trying to put 25 gallons in that 22-gallon tank. So it's a type 1 is a very fascinating you know, viewpoint towards our own, you know, non-diabetic friend athletes. So yeah.
Before we move on to that period of during exercise, anything you may have shown this off the top, or maybe there's something else you can show us, but is there anything that you can show us within the Engine 1 app interface in terms of helping you make that pre-workout food consumption decision, and also how Engine 1 can support, based on that, how much insulin that one should take in prior to their workout?
Yeah, well, certainly. Let's see if we can transfer the screen back.
Yep.
Okay, how are we looking? Got that. Oh, let's go back. Okay. So from the landing screen, all right, once we give the blood sugar, we'll do that. Yeah, the driver, again, for that, how much carbs are coming in prior to an activity, is based on that insulin on board. That's the most important number that's represented on the screen. And then, you know, if you were to take more insulin, I think this is probably, will really show it here. If I take 3 units of insulin, and I go back to the home screen, as you can see, but now you have 75 grams of carbs that you actually have to eat prior to activity. Before it was only 8. So 4 units, it's going to take you a lot more carbs just to start your activity. This isn't even what you're going to have to take 30 minutes into the activity. So most people would look at this and say, no way. And so you slide that into the future, and you can see now you're back to a more safe insulin level at that point. So, yep, that's kind of in a nutshell. The next part, if we start the activity, which we'll jump into. And
yeah, absolutely. So yeah, let's really jump into to during exercise. And Cathy, are you able to see Cliff's what Cliff is showing on the screen right now?
No, actually I'm not. So I don't know if your viewers can or not.
Yeah,
okay.
Let's get that fixed real quick, Cliff. And in the meantime, I'll set up the net. Oh, there we go. Perfect.
There you go.
Gotcha.
Okay. Sorry about that, guys. All right.
No sweat. It's live TV, right? We deal with the elements. So. Cool.
All right, so before
take us back to what we were just talking about.
Yeah, what I was just describing that you guys weren't able to see, the insulin on board is, you know, 3.37 units, a lot of insulin. And notice you can see the carb demand has gone way up, 75 grams, whereas before we only had about 8. So if I slide into the future, there we go. It's back down to only 8 grams to eat prior to activity.
And that's a lot of extra calories too. So it's both, right? It's necessary, and then but it's also excess.
That's right. Yeah. You know, if you're trying to be only under by a very small amount of carbohydrates every day, you know, really 300 calories to 500 is a lot already, in my mind, and the way I try to keep people balanced. If you go to start an activity and you have to have 75 grams, that's kind of like your budget for the whole day to even have a little deficit. So it's tricky the more insulin you take. All right. So let's go ahead and start. And
so now you're gonna walk us through in terms of what the app can provide, and then we're gonna expand sort of on this in terms of the period during exercise and how we should view both insulin and the fuel we take on.
That's right. Yeah. So here we are live doing an activity here. We're jogging, and our perceived effort on a scale from 1 to 10 is a 5.5. perceived effort also does dictate glucose and how much we're going to have to take in, including if you go really hard, that actually can raise glucose levels. And if you go too easy, then glucose levels can rise again because now digestion happens more rapidly. So we were talking a little bit before about steady state versus not steady state. That's a very important thing for type 1 diabetes. The other thing that's kind of important that we'll highlight, type 1 or not, is impact grams. So what Engine 1 does is it has an algorithm built into it that's going to accommodate proteins, fats, and carbohydrates. And so you can look here and basically say, how much more food do I have on board, to this activity? So right now, this person has a pretty good metabolic workout going. They didn't eat anything before. There's 0 grams on board, and they're moving along. So if you were to update, and let's say we're going to have a banana, and you can just add that, confirm it, and then when you go back, you can see now there's 27 grams right there on your upper right-hand corner, telling you, how much is still being absorbed into your bloodstream, how much is still, maintaining that blood sugar for you. It doesn't matter if you're type 1 or not. I think this is a pretty cool feature. I'd want to have this on my Garmin if I could.
Great.
Absolutely. So that's really cool stuff. It's cool to see how the app works in real time. What's interesting in terms of impact grams, we don't necessarily have an exact equation for this for UCAN, but Cathy, it would seem to be based on what we know about the science of UCAN, that UCAN would not have the same impact grams in terms of, like the banana would, like Cliff just entered. What can you say to that in terms of what we know about UCAN and the impact it might have?
Yeah, well, again, it's what Cliff was saying. It's running in the background, right? So it's just dribbling in, and so it's allowing the body to do what it needs to do normally, instead of having to put extra fuel on the system that is in bulk, so that the system then has to deal with. And so, we know that when people are hyperglycemic, when they go into exercise, it forces them to use more of their plasma glucose. So it's kind of the reverse of that. Let's keep it as nice and steady and even and in a reasonable level, and just have it go in the background during the exercise, so that there isn't a lot of extra intake of case superfluous carbohydrate if you can keep your blood sugar normal, right? So it allows you to have the body judge how much fat can you really burn, how much glycogen can I spare under those conditions, so that you have more power later on in your workout.
And just to be clear on this, Cathy, when you talk about hyperglycemic, that means high blood sugars, right? So when we've talked about hypoglycemic earlier, we're talking about low blood sugars. Hyperglycemic is the opposite, and it's symptomatic of a lot of what type 1 diabetics, the challenges they face. Cliff, in terms of taking in insulin during exercise, is that one of the biggest challenges that the athletes you face that are diabetic face? I think you sort of just talked us and walked us through this, but would you say that's the biggest challenge they face during exercise? Or if not, what is the biggest challenge that they'll face in terms of that fueling during exercise?
Oh, I think that's absolutely the most complex nature of it. That's what I've studied my whole career, right? Every race for me was an opportunity to document that. So you've got these different windows that you're kind of compartmentalizing. You've got an active person who's moving around, and their insulin and their physiology is rapidly changing. Even prior to some sort of an event, you're going to get an adrenaline response. But then outside of activity, that's a completely different time period. So one thing, for instance, like if you look at a lot of type 1s that I work with, they'll struggle with the tapering process, right? Every day has been the same, their training's been very consistent, their activity level's very consistent, and then they'll come into this tapering phase and, they'll hear this, you have to carb up kind of a thing, and their activity level's down a little bit because they're trying to charge up, but their glycogen storage is topped off, and so that insulin sensitivity is now not nearly as much, and the dosing gets really confusing there. And so what happens is the basal rate has to be throttle wide open, and you go to the highest rate that generally your doctor would probably want you to have. And I think that that phase is where UCAN or slow burning carbs becomes absolutely a must. Like I think tapering with slow burning carbs, fresh quality fruits and vegetables is huge because you just don't need all the carbs at that point. It's really trying to parse the timing of all this stuff. But I think that's one of the major struggles that type 1s face for racing. Even for non-racing, then I think it's also trying to figure out, like during an activity, this is more of a doctor-patient problem where when you go to your doctor, right, they say, well, here's how much insulin you should take, okay? The average person doesn't really have to think about that, but for a type 1, that means the doctor's telling you to turn right, but he's really telling you to turn right when you probably needed to turn right like 300 miles ago. So it's really tricky to try and get this stuff. That's why Engine 1 is a real-time app, and that's why, like even dosing for me on the fly, even though I have all the math and I've done all the studying and, worked with so many athletes over so many years and collected all the data, even I'll flummox it every once in a while because I, just can't get the math as accurate because there's, especially how the insulin duration is peaking. And if you have multiple injections, you could think about if you had a graph, it would have 3 different lines that peak and tail off, and how their mechanism of action of lowering your blood sugar is changing, and through that time period. And so you're stacking insulin, which that's not a natural process. So it's really, really, really tough. It's almost like we set ourselves up as type 1s for failure if we're not parsing out and saying, hey, you're in this window. Your clock is only 90 minutes, 2 hours out. Sorry. You really should be thinking no insulin. And the guidelines need to change for that because it's just walking people into trouble, I find.
Do you have a target blood sugar range that you strive for to maintain during exercise? Is there a range you try to always be between?
I do. These days, it's normal, 80 to 120. And I wouldn't say that before. Everything I just told you took many years of studying and learning to know, right? So before, when I was in my 20s and even in my teens, I'd do my test and I would see a blood sugar of 190, 180 and say, good to go, because I know that I'm going to come down quite a bit. That just doesn't happen for me anymore because I'm really removing a lot of that insulin prior to activity, which is a lot of the concepts for non-diabetics we're talking about is just conscious of what you're eating before, because your body's going to have to produce insulin. So it's the same concept.
With athletes you work with, I mean, how much is that a key? Getting them to identify what range they should be in. I mean, how important is having that knowledge, and how do you sort of, like you just gave the example of yourself, how it was different years ago versus now. How do you sort of individualize that for each athlete?
Well, that's really was the tricky part. Is after I figured all this out for myself, I then had to find my best guinea pigs who said, "Hey, we'll absolutely do this." And there were a lot of people that are still looking for this information, and that's why I created Engine 1. As I was completely overwhelmed. I'm trying to normalize my process. So it then became a decision support system, and then evolved into a company and into Engine 1. What is so fascinating to me is you could never do a study of what I did to myself or to anybody else, right? I just kind of did it as like this was my project. So what happened was, it was so complex to kind of teach to other people that it deserved an app, basically.
If I can make a comment on that, because I think one of the things that people sometimes forget is they think, here's an underlying disease condition, and so these people, they're not going to be able to perform at the highest level, and that's just not true. So people like Cliff can perform at incredible levels, but we also know that if they can keep their blood glucose under control, they can achieve it, right? So it's a lot of it is, okay, they can do it physiologically, but if you have poor control, and that's why you need to see, that's why he helps people, but everybody should really, consult with your physician, work with your physician, try these things like Engine 1, because you're going to achieve a much, much higher performance goal if you can actually get a good control of your blood sugar. That's one thing we do know from research. So.
It's a great point, Cathy, and I think in this context we're talking about performance relative to exercise and athletics, but even from an overall energy standpoint, we could take that word performance and sort of extrapolate it to your day-to-day life, right? If we're better managing our blood sugars, if we have better energy, if we have better mental clarity, we don't fall as low, you can be more productive throughout the day, whatever it is you're trying to achieve. But certainly it's highlighted in the exercise setting.
Well, and we've highlighted it in terms of body weight and things too. So yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So let's jump to the final phase of our discussion, which is the recovery period. And, we touched on it a little bit in terms of the types of carbohydrates, and Cliff, in speaking to the point that in that recovery period, it's really a time where you can consume carbs, and you can, as a diabetic, consume more of these faster acting carbohydrates. Just to start us off again, what would you say the challenges that most people with type 1 face in that post-exercise period?
For type 1s, I think it's getting comfortable with taking a larger bolus. So bolus, the injection, the size of the meal time shot that they're going to take to cover those carbs that are coming in. The problem is every day for a lot of type 1s, at least with the current management, current recommendations, is every day is kind of like Groundhog Day. Everybody's got the same basal rate that they're running throughout the whole day. And the reality is insulin levels are fluctuating very rapidly, sometimes doubling, going up, sometimes being cut in half. And we have, in the future, closed loop systems of insulin and continuous glucose monitors that will help type 1s do this, which is fantastic. But basically, lowering those basal rates after an activity is super critical, because basically the bolus is locking in all those carbs that are coming in after the meal, after the workout, and then you've got this period of actually very good fat burning capability for multiple hours after activity. If you introduce a higher basal rate and you don't make an adjustment, right, and you're Groundhog Day and every day is the same, then you're going to go low. And so what I see typically with a lot of type 1s is overnight hypoglycemia, followed by a rebound effect when the glycogen surge is topped off, and then they don't take enough, they don't raise it back up soon enough. So I'd like to see, for a lot of type 1s, more manipulation heavily on the basal rate, and frankly being a little more confident with the bolusing aspect when they're very active. The basal-bolus relationship is something that I've studied a lot, and it's part of the decision support system I teach people, which shows that the higher the activity level, the more you have to contribute with bolusing amounts. And total daily dose is going to go down when that happens. And then when you flip it around on the other side and you're less active, there's this like 50-50% relationship, 50% carbs, or sorry, 50% basal and 50% bolus. And effectively, that's where we see the best control in very active type 1s. So.
And Cliff, in your words, sorry, Cathy, just or maybe either one of you could take this one. Just the difference between bolus versus basal, in case folks in the audience don't know.
Cathy, go ahead.
Well, it's what Cliff is saying. That basically the basal is sort of dripping in the background. It's to keep your steady, regular glucose production stable, in terms of uptake. And then the bolus is to account really for what you're eating and for dramatic changes that you might need to do. So, that's in a nutshell. Particularly if you're going to take in, a big meal with lots of carbs and things, you're going to have to have more rapid-acting insulin, a larger bolus, to be more physiological, like if I took in a big load of carbohydrates.
Gotcha. And Cathy, before I ask you that, I know you were going to expand on something Cliff said. Go ahead.
I'm trying to think what...
Sorry, I know I cut your train of thought over there. No, we can always get back. Great. In the meantime, I'll ask you one thing. So how does this all, just practically speaking, how does all this impact appetite control in that post-workout period? What's the relationship between, hypoglycemia and appetite control? What's the relationship between taking in insulin in the post-workout period and appetite control? How do these all go hand in hand?
Before we get to appetite, could I just make a statement in terms of, like, Cliff has been talking about type 1 and that post-exercise period,
go ahead.
and sort of that
Absolutely.
you know, your golden ticket, because there are so many people that are very insulin resistant, so they're also not responsive. And so that magical window of time, that sort of first hour, 90 minutes, and oftentimes the rate of glycogen repletion is so that the weight that you can put the glycogen back together, right, and stack it back up again, is really fast for the first couple hours, and we know that. So what he's leveraging the fact that the muscle is so responsive right then, and so you can build that pool. Well, if you're type 2, if you're obese, if you're insulin resistant, those individuals have we know that they have a real defect in building that pool anyway. And so this is the most magical time period of all in terms of them. Because think about it, if you can't put it together to begin with, and then you want somebody to go out and work hard, well, they can't do it. They don't have the glycogen to do it. So it's a catch-22. And there are a lot of type 1s that are also, particularly early on, if they're not exercising very much, they're also insulin resistant. So that period of time afterwards can all of a sudden grow that pool so that the next time they go out to exercise, they all of a sudden have the power to do more and then you're in those training zones, you're able to improve your fat burning capacity. You're able to improve a lot of the training adaptations that work, but you need to be able to work high enough intensity. So it all actually works for all of us, not just for somebody with type 1. That there really is that sort of magical window, and it really is key if you're doing 2 a days. So say Cliff is going to swim in the morning.
You beat me to it, Cathy. I was about to get in there. So for a number of years when I was trying to set the record as a type 1, I had 3 a days, right? So I would wake up in the morning, do my first workout, you know, on an empty stomach, have a huge breakfast, the largest bolus I could possibly take a nap, do some work, come back to the early afternoon and do another 2 to 3 hours of training, a bike ride, then another similar meal, huge bolus, biggest I could, you know, take without going low, and then another workout in the evening, another 90-minute run, let's say, and it was this constant process of timing the insulin and getting it in quickly after the workout, because I knew if I didn't take the shot sometimes, even at the end of, let's say, a run or a swim, that would extend my window until I could start to work out again, because there was so much insulin on board I wouldn't be able to be active. And so it was this very good process, right, of my window was a little bit longer, but recovery for muscles and certainly for glycogen, I mean, these are different rates depending on how hard you're being active, right? So if you're doing something very intensive, the recovery time is going to take many hours, up to 2 days even. But if you're talking about replenishment of glycogen storage, that can happen on a more rapid basis. But it's the same process of fueling down, fueling up, fueling down, and I think that process from an athlete perspective is what gets people very lean, frankly. It's a pretty natural process after a period of time, but I won't say it's easy on the work schedule.
That's for sure. So, you know, so I think just one more thing I wanted to hit on in the recovery period. You know, we talked about a few different elements of it, but in terms of appetite, you know, how does everything we're talking about impact appetite in the post-workout period? Cliff, maybe we could start with you. You know, from a type 1 standpoint, how does this all impact appetite?
Well, you know, the mix for me after an activity, it can't just be simple. I know we're talking about having a lot of simple carbs after, but really it's more this higher component. So maybe it's you know, 40% simple and 60% still moderate glycemic index foods. But if you don't make those windows, then what's going to happen is your appetite's going to be, you're going to be the cookie monster come, you know, midnight. And you really are going to be extending the recovery. Then your sleep is going to be off, and then the time to the next workout is really rapidly diminished. And so I think that that window, as Cathy has been saying, she really is like, hey, you know, this is really important. It is. That is, as a higher level athlete, that's a more important thing. Look, if you're just going around the block and, you know, you're just enjoying, you know, a leisurely ride, do you need to have this intensive carb replenishment? Will you be massively hungry? No, absolutely not. And your decision on what you eat can be far less dramatic than we're talking about. I think we're painting two different individuals here, you know, and what they need.
Great point, Cliff. Great distinction. Yeah, Kathy, what could you say? We've talked a little bit about the role of in the recovery period of some of these higher glycemic carbohydrates, and then relative also to an athlete like Cliff, who is doing 2 a days or 3 a days at certain points in his life. For the person that's not doing that, for the situation that Cliff just described, a person that's going out for a 30-minute walk or doing more of a moderate intensity type of workout, how should they view what they're ingesting post-workout in terms of being optimal for leanness and appetite control?
Well, I think it's really easy for people to think, oh, I just worked out a lot and I can eat. It's the license to eat. And I think that you have to just sort of, you have to put to rest, because it's not a license to eat unless you have a metabolism like Cliff, and then he has to. So there obviously are people who are competing at really high levels that have a hard time getting enough calories. So that's one. But for the normal person, my point is that there is a magical window that you can start to grow that pool so that you have more power. It doesn't mean that if you've only exercised 30 minutes, you're not going to go and eat lots of calories. You just are going to want to be selective. So the thing that can go in the background, particularly since you want to leverage what Cliff was saying in terms of the post-exercise fat burning, is something like UCAN, something that's slow as well, so that you can try to keep burning as much fat as you can. Because it is a time when your energy expenditure is usually up, and more so in men than women. Women tend to come back to normal pretty quickly, so we burn more fat during the exercise. But it is a time when you have to have a little executive control, so that you're not just saying, oh, I can just eat whatever and become the cookie monster more because you just think you can become the cookie monster and that it's a license to eat. So I think a lot of us have to say, okay, I didn't really spend that many calories.
It's a great perspective. Cliff, from an Engine 1 standpoint, I'm going to toss you the screen again. Maybe you can show us how the app works from a recovery standpoint. And I think you might just have to do a quick approval or something on your screen for us to be able to see it. So we'll have Cliff walk us through this from the Engine 1 standpoint in the recovery window, and then we'll just conclude the session with a few of the key takeaways. But go ahead, Cliff.
Yeah, great. So at the end of the activity session, whether you're a type 1 or not, the nice part about Engine 1 is it's going to give you an active recovery meal. It's going to tell you how many grams of carbs and proteins that you're going to need to take in based on the intensity, duration. Engine 1 also pairs with Bluetooth heart rate monitor, so you can use that too in your tracking. And the algorithm will help you, replenish what you've lost, basically. And if you can see that this was not a very intensive session, we only have one gram of carb and 1 gram of protein to do, so nothing too dramatic there. And then all this actually syncs to we have a web app for it as well, where you can do a deeper analysis, on all the different foods that you took in, the timing of it, and see it all on one timeline.
Wonderful, wonderful. That's great to be able to see, and really great to be able to see the app, kind of visualize it and see how it works on the screen. So thanks for doing that. Super valuable. So, we've covered a lot here today, and, happy that we are going to be able to make this available to folks as a recording. You should get this in your email within an hour or two after the session is complete. But let's conclude with a few key takeaways, and I'll just pose a couple questions to you guys from the audience. So, Cliff, I'll start again with you. If people are listening to this and they have type 1, what are 1 or 2 things that we talked about today that you'd really like them to hone in on, and leave the session kind of having an understanding and an awareness of?
I think that the most important thing is just determining how much insulin is on board, and always being conscious of when you take something that you're locking into it for a predetermined amount of time, and that for up to 4.5 hours when you take insulin, that's how long you're going to be locked into it. So I think that's probably the most important driver if you're a type 1, is having that insulin on board conscious.
And Kathy, for you, what have we heard from Cliff today that kind of everybody, whether they have diabetes or not, can say, hey, I should be considering this for myself, whether it's to get better exercise performance or whether it's to get leaner. What are some of the takeaways that we've learned from Cliff that we could all apply to ourselves?
I think one of the key ones is the planning. So the idea that, if you're somebody that has been told you're insulin resistant, if you tend to be overweight or obese, you probably are. So you have to think 3 hours before, 4 hours before, to really try to make sure that your insulins are low, and then use something like UCAN if you're hungry, so that you can actually go into the exercise and feel good, right? But so that you can burn fat. I mean, because the bottom line is if depending on what your goal is, if you want to try to stay lean and get the exercise and pull it all together, planning is going to matter. And it's a lesson that we can take definitely from the type 1s. And I think then the recovery is the same kind of lesson, that there's a timing issue where people that are insulin resistant can also really benefit from that first little window, just to try to bolster their stores so that they have power the next day. And so that it's not about eating lots of calories in that case, it's about being careful what you're eating to sort of move through as efficiently as possible so that you have the right energy for the next day.
It's great. So, I think for myself too, and hopefully a lot in the audience, definitely two big things we've taken away is planning is key and timing is key. And that's whether you have type 1 or not. It's not a one-size-fits-all approach, and you have to be prepared for, what your day might hold or what your activity level might dictate. Cliff, there was two specific questions from the audience for you that I just wanted to pose to you before we sign off. So one of them was for you from a UCAN perspective. What do you find the most beneficial application, either for yourself or for your athletes with type 1? Like, where do you find UCAN really, really coming in handy for you?
I think actually prior to an activity, if you are planning, to not eat before an activity, and you really are on the lighter side of things, your options of taking UCAN are really great, because you don't necessarily have to worry as much about, am I taking it like immediately when I go and exercise, or do I even have a 15-minute window? So you have this like incredible grace period. Physiology, and when you eat something, you drink some juice, it's going to go through your cheek and through your tissues and your mouth, and it's going to be sucked in right into your bloodstream. And your blood sugar goes from this nice stable 110 to suddenly you're 200. And UCAN is going to be so slow, it's just going to be a so slow uptick. So you have this nice freedom and flexibility. I think that's probably my favorite thing. And then the security blanket of stable energy. Like, the alertness you get is a big thing. When your blood sugar is dipping, diving, you can't concentrate. You can't be marshaling the resources you need. Forget about even just physical. It's alertness. So it's been a real game changer in terms of the portability aspect for me, for athletes that I work with, and my recommendations. Before I used to say, steel cut oats is like the way to go, but who's walking around with steel cut oats in their pipe bottle? Not a lot of people. It's not exactly the most tasty thing to take when you're on a ride. So,
Cliff, I remember when you and I first met. Gosh, it must have been 4 or 5 years ago at this point. That analogy still sticks in my head, where you said it's like having steel cut oats in a bottle, but it's going to leave you feeling light and energized, not weighted down like drinking steel cut oats. So yeah, absolutely, that's still sticks in my mind. And just one more for you, Cliff, kind of maybe a sort of a troubleshooting question. Connor says, I'm a type 1 diabetic endurance athlete. I've used UCAN. The challenge I have is because it's so slow, I tend to go low during the first hour. And then he commented that he might take something like Scratch or something more fast-acting to raise himself back up. And then he goes much higher. So I don't know if that's enough information for you to sort of, address that, or how do you in general deal with that challenge that people might face that Connor describes?
Yeah, I think, right, if you're going to use UCAN as your source, you really have to start thinking about backing out the basal rate much further in advance. You have to, either suspend insulin altogether for a period of time, and that's tricky too. And this is where, Edgerwin could help in this scenario. Even though UCAN's very slow, but that food on board, that impact grams on board would be something that he would want to reference. And so let's say going into an activity, it'd start at a 60% decrease in that basal, that background insulin, which could be started even up to an hour in advance. Usually it's like 30 minutes in advance will have some sort of effect. Yeah, and then at the end of the session, in his mind, he should be thinking, how much food is still working, how much could be still working. And we know from the literature with UCAN, and we know from the stable energy background about UCAN that it's going to be for multiple hours. So if you have another 10 grams to bolus for and take to cover, I would finish that activity and I'd say, hey, Connor, take enough to cover 10 grams worth if you've gone for an hour. If you've only gone for 30 minutes, maybe it's 18 or 15 grams that you cover. And similarly like that, it's just constantly getting that insulin down low enough before. And I think the gun shyness also comes too at the end of the session where people are so sensitive that they're not really conscious of the fact that they can bolus for what you still have in your stomach. But then, at the end of it, you're going to have to lower that basal rate, which we talked about a bit too. These are some really complex nuances to training and a lot of things that I work with people on a daily basis to get more succinct. I think probably the biggest thing is to compartmentalize pre, during, and post. And how you're treating pre-activity is going to be unique, and your goals should be, rock solid there. What you're doing during has to be, okay, this is this window, so this is what I'm doing here. Because transitioning between the two and trying to live in both, it doesn't work. You can't, take all the insulin up front. You can't not take any. So it's a little tricky. Engine 1 tries to help do that. It's trying to balance that stuff.
So yeah, clearly from what you said, it's a lot of testing, it's a lot of monitoring your own blood sugars. Now there's tools like Engine 1 that can help grab more data, but it really comes down to having to test it and having to understand the data and measure your blood sugars to find out the best timing. That's kind of how you went about figuring out for yourself?
Yeah, definitely. Without giving kind of all like losing the audience here into specific bolusing regimens and strategy and what percentage should I be bolusing at, because there is, again, quite a bit of math that goes into making that definitive, like how much should I take, like giving specific recommendations, which I love to do. I love to be very specific with data, but in this case, I think I need more information from him.
Well, great, Cliff. I'm going to give you, Cliff, a chance just because we have a few questions on how people can get Engine 1. I want to let you tell folks that here in a second. Cathy, before I do that with Cliff and then we sign off, anything that you wanted to add to the discussion, anything we haven't covered, or did what Cliff just answered stimulate any thoughts in your head?
I mean, I really enjoyed it. Thanks, Cliff. I've learned a lot, of course. I think this is great because it's so rare. I hope everybody realizes how rare it is to have somebody as esteemed as Cliff is to actually talk about this type of work, because somebody that understands and can manipulate but knows enough about the physiology and the metabolism to actually perform and to get it right it's really an art. Research certainly isn't there. So I hope everybody learned a lot tonight because it's a great topic. And don't be afraid to try, but I think always work with your health professional. Make sure that you feel like because maybe you've never exercised, maybe this is inspiring you to exercise. So work in tandem with people and that you trust and start to try things. Yeah.
Speak to Cathy's point on what a treat this is, Cliff. Just got a big all caps thank you from Connor for that last answer you gave addressing his specific question. So I know a lot of the sentiment in the audience has been very similar to Connor's sentiment on how valuable and educational this has been, and so that's really credit to both of you for being on here with us. Before we sign off, Cliff, folks that are interested in getting Engine 1 for themselves and starting to put it to work, how do they go about doing that?
Yeah, first, thanks for having me, Run, and Cathy, thank you very much for being on with me. It's been an honor to share this with you. You can get Engine One from the App Store, Google Play. It's available, and we're global at the moment with Android, and iOS will be global in 2 weeks' time.
Well, that's great. You're going to make Julie from Montreal a very happy person because she has on iOS in Canada. So, Julie, 2 weeks is what Cliff just said. Global on Google Play, and you will be receiving links in the follow-up email with this full recording. Download links for Engine One. So, if anybody didn't catch what Cliff said, you can get those directly from your email. And Cliff, just last question. I mean, we've been talking a lot about Type 1. Certainly, you've shared your experience in terms of Type 1, but is Engine 1 beneficial for people with Type 2 as well? Is there an application of the app for people with Type 2?
I think there's application for certain aspects of the app for everybody. I get that question a lot. When are you going to roll out one just for athletes, one just for Type 2s? But at the moment, I went where my expertise is, and I knew that this is a skill that I had, and I wanted the world to have it and be able to use it. And so that's why I focus there. But maybe someday, we'll see. At this point, I really like people with Type 1 to be able to have something that they can learn and leverage my experience and not go through that whole trial and error that's really tough.
Absolutely, and hopefully, with this session, whether you're Type 1, Type 2, pre-diabetic, or none of the above, hopefully we kind of we're able to help everyone understand why this is something we should all be caring about just from an overall health standpoint. Cliff, I'm going to put you, maybe I should ask you this before, I'll put you on the spot one last time. If people want to get involved, if they want to work with you, if they want to have you coach them, is that something that there's opportunities for them to do? I know you're a busy guy. Are there slots, are there openings for people to work directly with you?
Definitely. It depends on how many I'm working with at the moment, but please email me. Cliff@glucoseadvisors.com is great, or cliff@tristarathlete.com will find me as well. It depends on the space available, but I would love to work with anybody who's aspiring to learn more and get better at glucose control, frankly. Yeah.
Awesome. So we'll put that in there as well, a link to Cliff's website where his contact information will be there, so you'll get that in the follow-up email. I know there was a couple people inquiring about that. But with that, I just want to really thank you, Cliff and Cathy. When we go a little bit longer on these sessions, sometimes it's because I'm long-winded, but today I think it was because of the interest of the audience, the questions, and the fact that nobody was really dropping out of here the entire session. So I figured we'd just keep it rolling. But thank you both for sharing your expertise. It was really fun. I'm definitely smarter after this last hour and a half, so I appreciate that and just appreciate both of your time. Thank you so much.
Thanks, guys. Thanks for watching.
Thanks,
awesome. Yeah, thanks to everybody. Thanks to everybody in the audience. You will get a recording here in the next hour or two, and stay tuned. More to come. Thank you so much.
Thanks.